Hello and welcome to Chromatic Transformations Part 5. This video is going to bring together parts 1 through 4 and demonstrate some of the designs we can use for creating chromatic progressions utilizing triads. Before I begin, I would like to make the distinction between bass notes and root notes. Here we have a common 1 to 5 progression in C major. The first shows both chords in root position. The second shows voice leading between the two chords. You'll notice in the second progression, the G major triad is in the first inversion. This is to emphasize that when we are voice leading between chords, it is common that we will not always have the root of the triad in the bass. So here we have G actually being sung by the top voice or the soprano. So now we can discuss the tonic-subdominant-dominant cycle that I've been using in the last 4 videos. This cycle that we can kind of connect these categories and use these substitutions for creating progressions. So here we already have embedded in this cycle the standard 1-4-5. So we can go from, for example, the root movement from C to F to G. We can also see that this has the 1-2-5, or you can look at it as a 2-5-1. So the 1 to the 2 chord and the 2 to the 5 chord. So if we go back to this 1-4-5, we don't have to just use the 5 chord. For example, we can go, instead of going from F to G, we could go F to E, or we could go F to D flat, or F to B flat. Going back to this 1-2-5, instead of going to the G chord, we could go to the E chord, or we could go to D flat, or we could go to a B flat chord. So if you look at all of these possible root movements in this tonic-subdominant-dominant cycle, there are 64 possible root movements. So you can see that we can start the root on C, or start it on E flat, or start it on G flat, or start it on A, and then going to each of these different categories. If we strictly, we restrict ourselves to this tonic-subdominant-dominant, where we're going from one to the next without any kind of side motion or back cycling, we see that there's 64 possible ways that we can do this. So already we have a pretty great variety of possible progressions that we can create just from the tonic-subdominant-dominant cycle. And we can treat each one of these as a potential tonic. So now not only do we have at our disposal a kind of gravity of C major or C minor, but we can also utilize these other pitches as tonics, for example, E flat, G flat, or A. Now, if we look at each one of these root movements, there's really only 4 possible cycles. There's a cycle of 2, which is basically going up a second from C to D. There's a cycle of a 4th, which is going from C to F, or a cycle of a 6th. In this case, it's a minor 6th or flat 6th, going from C to A flat, and then going down a major 7th, which would be going from C to B. So now we want to look at some generalized voice leading that has been informing these transformations thus far. This is something that was inspired by McGoodrick's book, The Chord Almanac. And so if we have a cycle 2, we can kind of generalize this voice leading that the root is going to go down to the 5th, the 3rd is going to go down to the root of the next chord, the 5th down to the 3rd of the next chord, as you see here. If we look at the 4th cycle, this is going to be our generalized voice leading. If we look at the 6th cycle, this is going to be our generalized voice leading. And if we look at the 7th cycle, this is our generalized voice leading. So remember, we have a 2, a 4, a 6, and a 7 cycle in this possible tonic-subdominant-dominant cycle. By the way, those voice leadings, those generalized voice leadings, are all put together in a handout that's available in the description. So now instead of going just strictly from the tonic to the subdominant to the dominant, we can start, for example, on A, and instead of going to the subdominant, we can actually kind of suspend this transformation and go to a C chord. So we can go for the root movement of A to C, and then maybe C to D. And instead of going from the subdominant to the dominant, we go from D to perhaps A flat. And now we go from A flat to E. So now this introduces us into the other two possible cycles, the cycle of a third and the cycle of a fifth. So the cycle of a third here is going from A to C, and the cycle of the fifth is going from D to A flat. So now we have all of the possible root movements that we have with respect to the different intervals. We have a 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and a 7. And so now we need some generalized voice leading for the third, which is here. So the root would go down to the fifth, the third would remain a common tone to the root, and the fifth would remain common tone to the third. And this is a cycle 5 generalized. Again, these aren't the only voice leadings that are possible, but these are good places to start if you want really musical voice leading and a way that you can transform from one chord to another in a really musical way. So now let's go back to that tonic-subdominant-dominant cycle that we've been using. And now I've been really talking more about root movements, but now we need to start to introduce this idea of the chords that we're going to be using for each of these root movements. So for each one of these root movements, we have the potential of 4 different triads, either a major, a minor, a diminished, or an augmented. And if you go back and you look at levels 1 through 6, essentially we have all of the triads available to us. The question is, how much tension do you want in the progression? How far do you want it to kind of veer away from the C root or whatever root you're using? And that's where the levels 1 through 6 come in. The higher the level, the more tension you're going to be utilizing. And really, at the end of the day, it's not a matter of whether it's a rule or not, or whether you should do that. You really should use your own ears as far as, well, what colors do you want to use to create this sound world that you're trying to portray? Like, what is this sound that you're going for? This is just a way that we can explore these different kind of chromatic progressions in a fairly systematic way and find things that we like and things that perhaps we don't like. So they're in this order of tension as well: major, minor, diminished, augmented. Major is the most stable, followed by minor, diminished, and augmented. Once we get to the augmented chord, the augmented triad, that is, it's kind of a special chord. We find major, minor, and diminished triads in the major scale. So these are very fundamental to basic tonal harmony. However, we have to start to veer into these other scales to start to get to augmented triads. And they have their own special kind of quality. Turns out that augmented triads are really ambiguous in terms of their tonality and kind of where they're going. And the reason for that is that each root in an augmented triad turns out to be each note in an augmented triad turns out to be a root of another augmented triad. So if we look at the inversions of the C augmented triad, C, E, G sharp, right, and we look at those two inversions, and then we just enharmonically change those notes, it turns out that the first inversion of C augmented is E augmented, and the second inversion is G sharp augmented. So now we have this kind of understanding of why augmented triads are so ambiguous, because a C augmented triad is at the same time an E augmented triad and a G sharp augmented triad. So it turns out that if we kind of build all of these and look at them, there's only 4 augmented triads. The inversions of each of these is just a repetition of kind of the root, whatever you want to look at. In this case, I'm just using C, D, F, and G because I've been kind of talking about C major and using C as kind of the home base tonic. And so this can give us just an understanding that really there are only 4 possible augmented triads, C, D, F, and G. Every other augmented triad is just an inversion of those. So again, this is why they're so ambiguous and why they can kind of give us this suspended kind of quality. You'll find this a lot in film scores and television as well. And so this last grouping, G sharp, A sharp, C sharp, and D sharp, these are rather awkward in terms of their naming. A lot of double sharps are there. So we can also refer to these as A flat, B flat, D flat, and E flat. How you name them, it really doesn't matter at the end of the day, because no one hearing your music is going to know what you named the chord. They're just going to hear what chord you decided to voice and how you decided to contextualize that chord. In other words, where in the progression is that chord being placed? And they're going to hear it always in the context of the progression, not in isolation, unless you just have a song that has one chord in it and that chord just continues to ring out. So now we go back to this tonic-subdominant-dominant cycle. And for the sake of simplicity, let's just take C, A, F, D, and G. Now we can start to introduce different triads and different colorings and throw these different levels all together and kind of do some experimentation. C, A minor, D minor, F, and G are in blue because these are triads that come from C major. So these are in kind of my language that I've been developing here, level 0. There is no transformation. This is just the basic C major scale that we start with. All of these other triads are coming from these different level transformations that I've been demonstrating in the previous videos. So now instead of just looking at this tonic-subdominant-dominant, we can actually start to expand and continue this cycle beyond just these three and just continue to kind of play this out. And we can kind of start to experiment with different root movements. So we could go, for example, as we previously have, from C to D to G, maybe going to A to F to G, and then we could terminate that on C. And we could just have this cycle, and this could be our repeating root movements. Now, we could really kind of play around with having different kinds of flavors of triads, whether they be major, minor, diminished, or augmented on each of these root movements, and kind of play around with some of these transformations. We could also, instead of just repeating this cycle, we could just continue it and going from D to E to C to F to D flat, and perhaps terminate this cycle on C. And maybe this is a longer cycle that we repeat. So now we look at this expanded kind of cycle that we're looking at, this tonic-subdominant-dominant, and each one of these different rows or columns can be treated as a different tonic. So for example, here we could look at C as a tonic. We could look at F as a tonic, or B flat as a tonic, or E flat. And this can continue all throughout each of these columns. We can treat any of the notes in any of these columns as a tonic. And one of the things you'll quickly notice if we look at the notes of C, E flat, G flat, and A, that they actually repeat. So every third column is just a repetition, just stated in a different order, of this original C, E flat, G flat, A tonic. So as we look here, we can see that we have D, or the dominant, the subdominant, and the tonic. So each of these rows, these columns, can be treated as each of these tonic, subdominant, dominant categories. So we can start from anywhere, we can kind of go anywhere. But just for the sake of simplicity, let's just look at this as this kind of continued expanded dynamic. There's only 3 possible different tonics in terms of these categories. So now we can kind of see the context of how this repeats and how we can kind of play around with these. So here is our expanded kind of template. By the way, there's a handout for this expanded template you can print out and kind of play around with and go from each of these different root movements and experiment for yourself. But let's go ahead and kind of build a progression. So we're going to go from C to A to E flat. So we're kind of suspending this transformation to the subdominant just yet. And now we're going to the subdominant. But instead of going straight to the dominant, we're going to go ahead and suspend that. We're going to go to D, and now we'll go to G, and now we'll go to C. Then we have to decide, do we want this to be a major progression, a minor progression? Are we going to start with a major triad as C, or are we going to start with a minor triad? What kind of tension do we want? And so for this progression, I've just decided to choose C to A minor to E flat augmented to F to D minor to G to C, like this. So that's just one way that you can start to kind of build these progressions. So here, instead of starting with a C major, let's make this a more minor progression. So in this case, we'll start on C and maybe go to A flat. And in this case, again, we don't have to either restrict ourselves to either the subdominant or the dominant. We can actually even go back, and I'm going to back cycle here to E flat, and then to F, to D, to G, to C. And again, I'm kind of sticking to C minor here. And so this is the progression that we get. And so we can build any progression that we want and start to experiment and explore some of these chromatic colors. So again, instead of a short progression, let's go for a longer progression. So in this case, we're going to start on C again. Let's go to D, to G, to B flat, to A, to F, to C sharp or D flat. Any of these can be enharmonically named, to C, to B, to E flat, to A flat, to G, and now to C. And so, then we have to decide what kinds of triads we want to build here. For the sake of this example, I've just decided to utilize these triads. And so here's this longer cycle. And so now we can experiment again with a longer cycle. Instead of starting with C major, let's make it a C minor cycle. So in this case, I'm going to start with C, going to D, and we're going to make that a diminished triad, and then going to G, to B flat, and I'm going to back cycle to A flat, to F, and this is going to be F minor, and D flat, to C minor, to B diminished, to E flat, to D, to A flat, to G, and C minor, such as this. And of course, these are merely exercises. These aren't really songs or developments yet, because right now they're just templates, and there's a lot of chordal information in a short amount of space. We can expand these out, and that's really what we're going to explore in part 6, which is going to be coming soon. The additional thing that I'm going to be looking at in part 6 is how these different scales from these transformations can be used melodically in terms of building melodies, and also in using for solos and improvisation and other things. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you've gotten something out of this video. Again, if you look at the description, you'll see some handouts that are available. Thanks so much.